the thing, especially for educational products, is understanding what the end goal is. And if it's to teach kids to read or math or social emotional learning, it's so important. Like, that's what the end goal is. And so the music should enhance, and it shouldn't get in the way of anything. And so the first question is music necessary?
Bonjour! Welcome to White Walls! My name is Mathieu Penaud. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, passionate about the role of design and technology in education and learning. In this podcast, I interview inspiring educators, researchers, designers, and innovators to discuss their journey and insights as they imagine and build the future of learning. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite episode with fellow parents and educators, and make sure you don't miss our next guest by following White Walls on your favorite podcast platform, or even better, by subscribing to White Walls' free newsletter on Substack. Thank you for being part of the conversation, and now, your episode. Today on White Walls, I am thrilled to welcome our first ever professional musician guest, Jerome Rossen. Jerome is a composer, songwriter, and professional musician whose work spans TV, film, video games, advertising, theater, and more. You've likely heard his music in hit TV shows like The Bachelor, Temptation Island, Extreme Makeover, and my personal favorite, Happy Tree Friends. He's also composed for children media, creating music for games like Get Ready for Kindergarten from LeapFrog, apps like Math Tango 2 from Originator Kids, and his latest project, an interactive book experience with Kibeam. Beyond his creative work, Jerome serves as Director of Events for the Bay Area Children's Media Association, which is how I had the pleasure of meeting him. In this episode, we will discuss Jerome's creative process, especially when creating music for others, and the specificities of composing for children. We will also talk about the impact of AI and technology in writing music. So Jerome, thank you so much for joining the conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mathieu. It's just so nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
I told you just before we started, it was so easy to find questions to ask you because I'm so interested in your whole creative process and all the work you've been doing. So it's going to be an interesting conversation for sure. And we're going to start, as we always start, with some rapid fire questions. So my first question is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Akron, Ohio. It's the home of the band Devo and also LeBron James.
Ooh, okay, nice. And where do you live now?
And I live in Mill Valley, just across the bridge from San Francisco.
And who was your favorite teacher?
I think I probably have a group of teachers that were my favorites. But I had a English teacher in 11th grade, and he was one of these people that said, you don't have to follow all the rules. He's a very smart person. And he made us do things like read the last paragraph at the end of a short story. And so we would know how it ends, and that you'd have to go back to the beginning, like, well, how does it change it now? And so I think he showed narrative in a different way. And I really liked story and English and narrative and all that stuff.
Super interesting. And is it something that you do with music as well? I mean, we get more deeply into the creative process, but
absolutely, yeah. That's definitely something. This is Mr. Smith. That's something that I took with me forever after. Yeah.
Awesome. So talking about music, and that's probably a hard one, but what is your favorite instrument?
My first instrument is the piano, so I always go back to that. But I love something about probably every single instrument. One of my favorite places in the world is the Museum of Musical Instruments in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's just a big collection of musical instruments from all over the world. It's unbelievable. I mean, I could spend days there. When I've been there before, I've been there for hours, and my family's like, "Hey, like, we have to go now." But I typically just love, like, anybody who's playing an instrument. I'm just transfixed.
What was in the museum? What was your most surprising or most impressive piece?
I think there's the whole group of instruments from Africa, because I can generally like put an instrument in my hands and figure out how to play it. I might not play it well, um, but these had so many different ways to play it. Like it's a resonator, but then there's also a string. I wish I knew the names of all of them, but I was fascinated by the whole African segment. It was great.
Hmm. Okay, this one is probably even harder. What is your favorite song? And if it's too hard, we can say your favorite like music genre.
It just depends on the day. And
Yeah.
I think I pick different favorites um, depending on what I'm working on. There's times that I specifically don't listen to music because I need to be careful what I'm influenced by. Um, I'm I'm pretty good at not copying because I have kind of a selective memory. So I actually like getting a blurry representation of something. And so if I get it a little bit wrong, then I go back of like, oh, is this exactly what it was supposed to be? And then it's a little bit wrong. I'm like, oh well, maybe I wrote that. I'm not sure. Um, so let's see. This is a long way for me to deflect the answer. I would say that I always go back to jazz music because that's what I studied, and um, there's such a rich history there. And even when I was beginning to study jazz music, there's a lot of it I didn't really like because I didn't understand it. And I don't think you have to understand something to like it. There's a lot of world music I listen to. I don't understand the words, but I understand the feeling and I just love it. Like I love Brazilian music. I love a lot of Latin music. I've not answered your question at all.
That's perfect. To be honest, I did not expect like a precise answer, but more of like that kind of conversation. So that's perfect. Going back to school and education, what do you think is one thing that all kids should learn at school?
I think communication is the biggest thing, especially where we feel like I feel like we're in such a fractured world, and through communication, hopefully you pick up empathy. Like all of the social emotional stuff is just so important, and I get concerned about some of the models we have in our society. Not trying to get political, and it just if we can just speak with each other in person, I think that's would go a long way toward just being able to live comfortably and for each of us to sort of fulfill our own dreams and destiny.
Yeah. And what is one thing that all adults should learn at work?
Oh my gosh, maybe the same, but I would say play. I
Hmm.
think there's creativity in working on a spreadsheet, and there's creativity in whether it's brainstorming, learning like improv games like yes and so if there's a group of people at a conference table and there's a power dynamic there, like it could be the newest person there, which may also be the youngest person, could have some great idea that nobody thought of. And if there's this power dynamic of like, oh no, that person doesn't know, they're too new. If they get shut down, like, well, that's not a creative environment. So if people can learn to be playful with their ideas, to use yes and, I think that could go a long way to just making the best ideas come to the top.
Yeah, and opening the conversation to everybody so everybody can contribute and
Absolutely.
feel comfortable. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And what is the latest thing you did for work?
So right now I'm working with a company called Kibeam, and they make a wand where you can learn little kids can learn to read. So it's right now books for first through third graders, and you aim the wand at a paper book. And so the idea is that learning how to read is kind of hard, and teachers can't always have a one-on-one interaction with every student all the time. And so this is just a really rich experience for kids. So I'm working on this, the latest that I worked on. And so we don't have a commercial product yet. I think they're hoping for a commercial release this year, but they're in school systems, lots of testing. I just worked on a Jackie Robinson book, which I love. I'm a big baseball fan. And it's this beautiful book that his daughter Sharon wrote about how he took Sharon, her siblings, and a bunch of friends on the frozen lake near their house. So it tells all the rich story of his whole experience with civil rights and baseball and integrating the major leagues. But it's also his bravery because he didn't know how to swim, and so he went on this frozen lake. And so one thing I liked about this book, and it usually it's the case of all these books. I'm always pushing myself to do something different. So this was a little more of kind of almost a Disney feel for the music because it was a lot more emotional just because you could go there, and it's a third grade book, and so
Mm.
most of the time the music's just like staying like so far out of the way of the dialogue because the whole point is for kids to learn how to read. But there's some really important emotion here, and I was able to frame that, and it was really fun.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. And what is the latest thing you did to relax?
Probably I went on a walk with my dog, which happens frequently. So my dog's Disco. She needs lots of walks, we also spend lots of time in the backyard playing fetch. So lots of time, and Marin has lots of good nature, so that's great. So between hikes and just playing fetch with her, I'm in nature a lot.
Nice. I can relate. Wonderful. Thank you. Now it's time to get to the main part of our discussion. When you look back at your journey from where you started to where you are now, like how do you feel?
So first, I feel old. But I realize there's two parts of it. So I teach. I'm a composition teacher at SF State. That's just a couple like a half day job. I love it. I'm in touch with students that are sort of beginning this journey, and if I if I think quickly of like, oh, I don't know if I have a lot to offer or much to teach, but then I realize like, oh, I'm giving examples of work I've done like 20 years ago, and it resonates. And there's something about maybe it's compound interest where things add up. And if you try to do something and you're always pushing yourself, then you just get better at something. And so my goal is always to try to just improve on every project I work on. And so I don't think I have quite the work ethic of a LeBron James or Giannis Antetokounmpo, where they're like really striving excellence, and you see it on the basketball court. I'm not there. But if I keep pushing and I'm always trying to do new things, like there's sort of a body of work there. There's sort of all these different projects that I've worked on that I'm proud of that. And I'm not done by any means. I hope I have another 20 or so years to do this. And who knows where the technology is going. I want to learn what all that is too, and offer something and make it every project I work on better as well.
Hmm. That's interesting. I'm wondering when you listen back to these older pieces that you created, do you feel that you would do them differently now? Do you feel like, oh, I should have added this part, or how do you look back at them?
There's two parts. I mean, it's anything that I've shipped, it's done, and you can't go back. And so a lot of, I think for 98%, it served the purpose of the project, and the client was happy. I was happy. Certainly, I've learned, and technology changes too. I mean, I have a studio now, which 30 years ago, a lot of it wouldn't have even exist just because the software, but it would take up rooms and it would cost, $60,000, just to begin with. So I have just even from 10 years ago, I have, better technology. Everything's quicker, faster. Um, so yes, like if I do listen back a little bit to my work. I think it's helpful, but I don't listen for the flaws because it could be too much.
Mm. Yeah, that's something I want to like dive a little deeper into, which is your creative process, because there's a lot of different steps. As the starting point, like how do you start from that, the brief or the blank page in front of you? What is your guiding? What are your guiding principles when you create a music? Like how do you overcome being stuck? And as you said, like how do you consider the piece to be finished, even though it can never be fully finished? Like how does that whole creative process like spans out for you?
Yeah, so that's all real, and getting stuck. I want to get to that as well. You alluded first to the brief, and so for listeners that may not know what that is, it could be as simple as two sentences where, this is a project that has a monster who's on a quest to, find its home in a cave. Like that could be enough. And then they might have genres of music that could could be. It just depends. But so the brief is just, words. It's just usually English. Um, that's not usually enough to start with. In the beginning of my career, I think I had kind of the fingernail idea of what something would be, and I just started writing, and I was just, headstrong. I'm like, oh, I know exactly what they need, and I had no idea what they needed. And, it took a couple times to get punched in the ego, and I took it personally. Like, I thought like, "Oh, you don't like my music means that they don't like me." Like, no, like, that's not what they meant at all. And so the process has definitely evolved, and what I do now is I try to get as much data as I can. And so in this fictional idea is if it's the monster, like, okay, it's actually an app that teaches math. And like, what's the most important part? Like, okay, well, maybe they're teaching multiplication and there's different levels. And so I try to get as much data as I can. So if there's rough artwork, if there's, if it's a video game, if there's a playthrough, if there's a concept from the creative director that they've always thought that like, some genre or some artist would work, like, let's bring all of that in. And so it's formulating all of that. And I don't write anything until I have that. In fact, I might go as far as putting an audio mood board together with the client. You can use all kinds of design thinking. You can even test the audio mood board. It depends how far you want to get into it. So sometimes it just depends on the project. Sometimes you can go a little far, but the idea is to get on board with the client of like, yeah, this sounds right. I had an interesting example in, I guess it was maybe 6 years ago or so. I worked on a game which they wanted like an award show theme once you finished a level. And award show is a pretty broad term. And so I thought I knew what they meant, but I wasn't sure. And I sent like 5 examples from the 70s, 80s, 90s on of award shows. And I thought they wanted like sort of this cheesy, loungy, goofy, because I usually go towards something funny. And
Mm.
they didn't at all. They wanted funk music. And if I had written the cheesy, like goofy thing, they would have said, like, who's this guy? Like, what? And so I'm glad I didn't write anything until they said like, "Oh, this is what we want." And so when I delivered that, they're like, "Yeah, this is great." And so when you have buy-in, and there's sort of that secret of, if there a way to show that they came up with the idea, then that's what you want. So once I have all that, then I'm coming from an informed place. The next step for me is, there's probably some sort of theme, and there may be some sort of material that comes from that. So it probably starts with humming, and then I use a metronome app on my phone. I might be like coming up with that theme while I'm walking around with my dog. I don't necessarily force myself like, okay, I have to come up with a theme now. Although I might say like, okay, let me come up with 3 themes, and I'll record it in the voice memo app on my phone. So to me, that's just like using a tape player when I was growing up. It's just documenting it. And
Mm.
then I want to get a little space from it. So even an hour or overnight, and then decide like, okay, which one of these is actually working. And then I kind of get into that blurry thing again where I get something exact with the theme, but I'm still doing a prototype. So from that place, I'm recording a theme, and I'm probably hearing all the instruments in my head, but it might be inexact. And then I'm going to want to get feedback from the client. So I might do a small portion of the project, or I might record the theme. And it sort of depends on how much audio imagination my client has. Um, and I've learned throughout the course. So sometimes I can just send a piano prototype and say like, hey, this is where the French horns will be, and there'll be timpani. Um, Honestly, for the most part these days, I just send an almost finished demo, which if they like it, like that's going to be the final. And so they listen to that, or we make changes. I'm really big into iteration, and that's honestly where collaboration comes from. So that part of the beginning of my career where they gave me feedback and it was no, it was like I was shying away from that. Like that's the part I lean into because that's where the collaboration is.
Yeah, that's actually something very interesting because when you train as a musician, you're not trained on like handling this kind of like business relationship and people management and how did you learn that? Other, I mean, like obviously as you went and as you had like more and more experiences, you learned how to interact with these different people that you have to interact with. But did you get other ways to learn that other than just pure
Yeah,
experience?
I mean, I think this could be very male, but I'm an experiential learner. So I think
Hmm.
I had to get burned a couple times and realize, like, nah, this isn't the most efficient way to do things. And I think it's important for what I do and for what it could be what all artists and creatives do in pursuit of a job like this. Like I'm working for somebody else. Like I'm serving the creative purpose of somebody else's vision, and I'm 100% okay with that. Some people aren't, and there's sort of two ways to dice that. One is you could just not do that at all and just do your own art and figure out a way to, either have a different job and just have your art on the side, or you can, also just serve that creative purpose. And I feel I'm a hired person, a mercenary. If you get down to it, like I want to be a collaborator. I don't want it to. It doesn't have to be icky and like all the whole capitalism thing. Um, but I think it's also important to do other stuff on the side. If you feel like, oh, like I'm not getting to, play metal guitar in this role because I'm doing music for kids. Like I actually don't play metal guitar, but like if that's important to you, then do that. Like do that in the evenings or on the weekends. So I think
Mm.
it's in you're right when you're learning an instrument. There's this part of you, and it's probably the same with art of being an artist. And I think it's absolutely important to keep taste and to keep opinions and to be able to retain all of that stuff that you learned, and you want to bring your whole self to a project. Here's a silly example. I worked on the Happy Tree Friends for a bunch of years. I started in episode like 50 or so. They'd already done a bunch of episodes in Flash, and they were still working with Flash when I started, and they switched over to some other technologies in the middle. But I did about 300 minutes for the Happy Tree Friends. And for some reason, I always thought it'd be funny when the characters were in an elevator to do a bossa nova scene, because I always have this idea of the Blues Brothers. Right at the end of end of the movie, there's this like hysterical bossa nova. Ken, the creative director, just never liked when I fit it in, and I'd always try to put it in. And it was just my funny joke at a certain point of like, all right, this is the fourth time I'm gonna try, and I knew I wasn't gonna like it. That's really the only note I would ever go like, yeah, I don't want the bossa nova. But I've since done my own cheesy bossa nova tracks. I've sent it to my music publisher. Some of them have gotten placed in TV shows, and there's a place for it all. And so I mean, one of the I think big lessons for me as a just for my ego is when my client was saying that this isn't the right music. All they were saying is that this isn't the right music. They're not saying this is bad music, but getting the right music is really a skill. There's people that work with producers. So sometimes there's a producer in between me and the client, and sometimes there's a reason the producer is trying to figure out exactly what they need, and that's their only job. So yes,
Yeah.
I have taken on the job of a producer. It's like it's kind of easy for me. Like I don't always prefer a middle person of like, well, can you tell me everything the client said? Because a lot of times they don't tell me the negative stuff, and the negative stuff is actually the stuff that I need to delve into deeper. Of like, tell me more of why this didn't make you feel. If I get feedback back that how was it, and they say fine, that's just unusable. Like I can't. That's not enough.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I generally need feedback at least over the phone or a video call, so I can look at facial features and I can look at body language.
Yeah.
If it's just a text or email, unless it's like this is great, then I need more.
That's so interesting. So it happened that you shipped something that maybe you yourself as an artist would have said, that's not the best music that would fit that context, but because that's the one that the producer wanted, then you still feel like satisfied because you delivered the piece that made the producer happy.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, most of the time, when I get feedback from somebody, it does serve the project better. I don't think I've
Mm.
ever shipped anything and said like, oh, iteration 2 would have been better than 6. It's so
Mm.
important to, first of all, for me to get like all the business stuff out of the way, get the contracts out of the way. I want to negotiate all of those myself. If I have questions, I'll ask my lawyer, have them educate me, but I don't want somebody else to negotiate the contract. I want to do it because these are the people I'm going to be working with anyway. And then the next part is who's making the decisions. And so if I'm working with somebody and then they'll say like, oh yeah, so-and-so up in that office, like she's going to decide like, okay, well, I'm going to need to talk to her too. Like, I want to know if she doesn't like it, like, what did she say? And so like with advertising, it's classic, like that everybody just has an idea of what they want. And so like that can be a little difficult. But I think in all of the things that I've worked on, it's definitely been better than when it started. Sometimes you question the process. It's difficult if somebody's hasn't worked with a musician before, because they might want to hear all the options. And so like you can, but like here's what it'll cost you, because it's
Yeah,
time. And so
yeah.
sometimes I feel like I might have an idea of what might be the best choice, so I'll send 3. I'll send what I think is like I think they might pick one. Number 1. Here's number 2 is what they kind of think they asked for, and here's number 3. It's like totally in left field. I can't imagine that they're going to go with it. Sometimes they pick 3 of like, oh, let's go here. Like, fine, like let's do this.
Yeah. And I imagine that producers also have like a bigger picture maybe of like the project itself. And so that probably also influences their expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I need to lean into that because they might have more information that they have that they realize than that I need to know as well. And so, just as simple as like, well, what's the target audience for kids? And that doesn't necessarily mean I make something less complex, but if it's a kids project, is it also kids and family? Like I'm always going to put something in for parents. Like there's just always going to be a reference to something that I grew up with, and so somebody's
Mm.
going to hear that, and kids might not understand of like, oh, that's a pirate reference, or that's something like that's Brahms, or that's something from like a really long time ago. But they'll know it. Like there's these cultural things that we do that I think stick with us. And I think it puts a culture and a tradition throughout our whole history, and kids just pick that up.
And talking about kids, how is it different to compose music for children or families as compared to adults?
So I've focused mostly on kids projects for about the last 12 to 15 years. And it is different. I think the majority of the work I've done is on education products. And I know that there's one group of people I was working on, they called it edutainment. So I don't know if I like that word or not. But I think the thing, especially for educational products, is understanding what the end goal is. And if it's to teach kids to read or math or social emotional learning, it's so important. Like that's what the end goal is. And so the music should enhance, and it shouldn't get in the way of anything. And so the first question is music necessary? And I've had these conversations with people where they want to do a lot of music of like, let's mock this up with somebody else's music. Like I think this might not be exactly what you want. And so I'm usually the first person to use as little music as possible, which sounds counterintuitive, but it needs to serve the project. So I notice with podcasts for kids, there's a couple different ways to go about it. And I think, and I haven't seen a lot of studies on this. I'd actually like to see more. If a kid is listening to dialogue and there's music, then their brain might shift a little bit and not hear the dialogue as well. So I'm generally of the goal of not having any music under dialogue. I've worked on a podcast called Keyshawn Solves It, and that was generally our rule. Like we do like a little bumper in the beginning and a little bumper at the end. And if it was really important, like we put like a note, like marking it, and then it would come in. I don't know if that was the right answer or not. Like it'd be interesting to test. Um, I think I think adults, for better or worse, can sort of half pay attention to things and still get plenty of the content. And so with a show like the Bachelor, there's music the whole time. And to be clear, I write music for a publisher, and then they shop it to the Bachelor, so I don't actually get to work with that production. But I pay attention to that show, and I try to look at how do they actually use music, and so like there's so much music there, and so if you did music like that for a kids show, like you have to be really really careful. So I think that's the biggest one is sort of knowing the end goal.
Yeah. I'm very curious about, you mentioned like more like little bumpers or jingles or like very short music elements. How do you write these? Because I can imagine writing a whole music and I make sense of the whole process, but for writing these little jingles, like where do you start?
Yeah, so right now with Kibeam, I get usually about 2.5 seconds to like that's the amount of time that works for a title, because you can just tell like the timing. It's just not necessary to have much longer. And so the best way for me to do that is to maybe write 15 or 30, and like here's the big broad theme. There's a superhero title that I worked on, and it's this like big beautiful broad theme. I can't use most of it, but if I find like the little essence of it, that's the 2.5 that I want, and it might be ba-bum. That might be it. And getting the instrumentation and getting it all so that it's broadcast ready. It's like it's nails for 2.5 seconds. Then like you really feel like you're there, and it'd be fun to have more, but I actually don't want more because the child is there trying to learn how to read. Like they're not there to listen to my music. And so
Hmm.
there's little tricks where if it's a storybook, there's a spread of page 4 and page 5, and you can figure out like, oh, at the end of page 4 their eyes are going to go up to page 5, like, ooh, I can put music there. And so I can accompany their eyes when they go to 4 to 5, so it could be at the end of page 4 it's like da 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 da. Like, so I get that's another 2.5 seconds right there. I get another little bit. And so for the theme, I absolutely have to think in terms of 15 or 30 seconds because I need more material. With the Happy Tree Friends, I don't think I ever wrote anything longer than like 8 seconds. And those again would be longer themes that I would just interrupt. So for humor and for horror, the idea is usually you don't want to forecast anything. You want the joke to do the work. So for humor, especially, like I try not to do funny music. Honestly, like let the joke do it, and let the joke happen, and then like maybe there's a reveal or maybe there's a reaction with the music. To extreme, like maybe you have a want want, but I never like with Happy Tree Friends, I never did a want want. So I think I think you have to be sort of like very very intentional, and get the essence of it if you have a really short clip.
Hmm. When you did the pom pom, it made me think of the Netflix opening. And I can only imagine like how much work goes into that.
Yeah, no, I mean I've heard stories about Brian Eno did, was it like Windows 95 or something, and he wrote like 75 of these things. Like I think he really got into it. But there is a whole field of audio branding, and again, if you employ design thinking and figure out like who's our target audience, like what would they want to hear, how do you want to feel, like you can do that in a couple seconds. It's very difficult. It's honestly easier to do it in 30. I know, and I don't know if it's the same, but there's a while where one of the requirements to get into film music school was to write a minute long piece and to change emotions within a minute, which is quite difficult to do. So, you're starting maybe in a tense place and you go happy, or, vice versa, or, pick any two, sort of contrasting feelings. And it's not easy to do.
Yeah, especially in 1 minute, I can
Absolutely.
imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we move to the next section, there's one more question I have about your creative process because you said something that intrigued me, which is the idea of walking your dog, being outside, doing something else, and having that inspiration coming and these notes coming and recording that. Is that how most of the creative part happens and then you work it out?
Yeah, I think probably the important part of that process, and I may not have outlined it very clearly, is that the marination and percolation part of taking all that data. And I sort of like think in my mind of like, how would I want how would I want to experience this if I'm the audience? And so I try to get outside of myself and think like what would work here. And so it does sometimes just happen in my studio. And I can't say it's struck by lightning. There's a fantastic jazz pianist that his idea, and he Lyle Mays, and he worked with Pat Metheny, and Pat Metheny told the story of when you are trying to get some sort of creative idea, you can just walk around and feel like, oh, I wish I was creative, or you can just get in your studio and practice and do the work. And he calls it waiting for the bus. And so if I put myself in that position where like I have all of the artwork around me, I have the brief, in some cases I have a paper book, I have everything. And then I look of like, okay, what's missing? Of like, oh, well, they need this musical theme. Like, what would it sound like? And it doesn't exist now. And I guess it sounds daunting. But for me, music is a language. And so like I know usually how it should start. And I also give myself the opportunity to make a horrible first edit or a first draft. I think it's important
Mm.
to give yourself the invitation to write something that's awful. Sometimes it's easier to edit than it is to come up with something from the beginning. I have a student that was stuck on something, and we just had to figure out why. And he's usually like quite prolific, and he's like, yeah, this is really weird. And what it turned out is he's writing for what was to be like sort of an unknown instrumentation. So he had to solve that. He had to say like, this is going to be an instrumentation, and he didn't really know the players, because usually when he writes something, he knows that there's specifically like this really great drummer that's going to play it, and he realized like, oh no, I'll play drums. Once he solved those things, he's like, okay, I got it, and he just started writing right away.
Yeah, because I'm asking because also I'm having this creative burst when things come and you don't know why and just everything aligns and you don't know where that's coming from. But I like that it also comes from preparation. It comes from you have thought about the problem before. You had some inspiration here and there beforehand. And so those things come together because you already have done that prep work. And talking about your studio, so I want to go now a little more into like the technology part of creating music. So we're going to talk about AI for sure because I think that's a very important topic at the moment. But before we talk about that, just would love to have a sense of what tools do you use today to create music?
Yeah, it's interesting. When people hear composer, they think, sort of pencil and paper, and that was definitely the way it was for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not, longer. I guess there's an oral tradition as well, but now I think you're sort of expected to also be a producer and an engineer, which really is a different thing. And so I started as a performer. I have a jazz performance degree from the University of North Texas, fantastic jazz music school. And somewhere along the line, I had moved to New York, and I realized I was always really interested in production. I was always asking questions of the engineer, and depending on who it was, like they'd be, showing me, or they'd be like, "Get away, kid." And so, especially as computers became more accessible and ubiquitous, I had a computer, and I just tried to figure out how to record things, and they were for these little projects. But it became like just essential to know how to do that. And so now it's the process is absolutely coming up with like something on however you come up with it, but it starts on my phone, humming, and then piano, and then depending on what it is, I might play a piano version, but it's into a digital audio workstation. So I use something called Digital Performer, which is a little bit more of a film composing program, and I just know it so well that I haven't made a switch over to something like Logic. I also use Logic, but not a ton. And then I mix into Pro Tools. And so what's kind of strange and a little clunky about my process is that I have a very strong split between when I'm doing music. So I'm writing music in Digital Performer. So I might start with the piano line, and then I'm orchestrating it in whatever instruments I have. So almost everything I do is inside the box. So it's all computerized music. And so I love playing with real musicians, but the speed of the deadlines I have, it makes it impossible. The budgets are kind of
Mm.
usually a restraint as well. But that said, I have a piano next to me, a beautiful grand piano that I barely use because there's so many different sounds you can get with the computerized piano, and it just fits into the mix so nicely. So I get everything sort of exactly the way I want, orchestrated, arranged in this one program, Digital Performer, and then I mix it in Pro Tools. So once I'm mixing, I'm still thinking very musically, but I'm thinking like an engineer. And since that part came second to me, and I've been doing it for 25 years or so now, but it's just a different thing. And so, to get broadcast quality audio for me, like I had to shift and like, okay, I had to ask an engineer tons of questions. I took just like a couple lessons, mostly learned online, and like that shift is super important. I found that if I'm mixing and writing at the same time, that I just
Mm.
get kind of mixed up. It's just too much, and I think at first I felt like I was trying to write like whatever the computer could do and whatever the digital audio workstation could do instead of what I wanted. And so at the beginning, the software was sort of driving the process. And like, well, wait, no, that's not what I want. Like, and so now being able to manipulate tempos is super important. Being able to manipulate note lengths. And so, just for instance, if I'm writing an orchestral line with a string section, when you put it into any program, it's just going to basically sound like a little better. But what you need to do is shape it, and so it might have an attack where it's like starts and then it fades out because any string player is gonna shape it, or maybe it gets louder. And so I'm forever shaping the sound on every single instrument. And what is a little idiosyncratic too is like I'm actually performing every single part into the computer, so it sounds like it's idiomatically correct. So I've been doing like some mandolin lately. I don't know if that's an instrument I'll ever be able to learn. Like it's just sort of difficult. I'm not a natural guitar player. Like I own a couple guitars. I play at guitar, but like mandolin's super hard. But like I know idiomatically what mandolin's supposed to sound like. And I feel bad for my friends who play mandolin. I'd love to have them come over and do it. But sometimes I'm playing something and I'm just changing the tempo a little bit. A couple of days later, like I can't have them over again and do it. It's just not realistic. So I feel bad about it. But so there's all this manipulation that you can do with computer with computer generated music. To me, like we'll get to AI, but to me, it's not that big a leap. Like we've been doing sort of what I call fake music for so long anyway. Like I don't think I'm fooling anybody. One last thing, I think critical listening is the sort of other key f- component that I think I've developed over kind of a long time. And I think you have to have the ears to figure out like, okay, what is it that's the essence of this reference track that I need to bring into my music? And part of it is the jazz background of being able to transcribe, and so I can also listen and transcribe of like, well, what's this Rachmaninoff thing doing? Of like, what's that inner line? What's that chord? What's the orchestration? How'd they do that? And so it's always like sort of backwards engineering the music and using those critical listening skills, which I think is super important. I've had situations where I ship something off and somebody played something and I said, well, what did you listen to it on? Like, well, it was just on our laptop in the conference room. I'm like, okay. It might sound a little different on headphones. And so I have just sort of, nice, true studio speakers here. I've got a couple of different sets of headphones. If you're listening on a laptop, you might feel like you're hearing things that aren't there. But if you listen critically, like hopefully the idea is that you're listening for truth and you actually hear what's there, and like there's a melding and like there's a good mix and everything's just working together.
Yeah, that's something that's fascinating for me is how sometimes I listen to music that I've been listening for years and I hear a new instrument. I'm like, wait, what? Where was that the whole time? And maybe I'm using like a different set of headphones or I don't know what it is. But literally, there's an instrument that suddenly I hear very precisely that I never picked up before. It's so interesting.
Love that.
But yeah, like with those tools, it feels kind of like anyone could write music with all kind of instruments without needing like to learn to play them. But I feel that there is that, I was going to say the 20% of like 80% you could create music, but then there's that 20% of really truly understanding music that is the part that makes a difference between music that's gonna fit and that's gonna be professional.
I think that's right, and I'm all for the democratization, whether it's AI or I think there's a while, maybe 10 years ago, everybody was a DJ. Like that's great. Like if it brings more
Mhm.
people into music, there's a couple programs that people would get excited about. I remember when GarageBand released a version on the iPad that was really gamified. My son was kind of youngish at the time, and he played GarageBand, and he said that was really fun. Like I want to play that again, and that's great. Like there's nothing wrong with that. To go from GarageBand to Logic is a little bit of a leap because there's not sort of as much there to push at you. It's sort of a push pull situation. I think I think the hard part is to know in your head what you want something to sound like, and then to be able to produce that. And so it's not necessarily coming from nothing. Like you might be coming from a reference track. Um, but I think if you're starting, it's sort of like maybe you're like GarageBand is color by numbers or something like that. I'm not sure the right analogy. It's like you're already starting with like some of that stuff. We haven't talked about it yet, but for me, AI, like some of it is trying to come up with the really fun stuff. Like I don't want to use AI to come up with the stuff that I really like doing, and I might at some point. Like I might use it for research of what are kinds of music that this kind of character might listen to. But it's not that different than the research I do now of like looking at a Spotify playlist. So like I'm absolutely AI curious, and I want to see where it goes. But there is a level where I see it's kind of going to the mean. It's going like this sort of average, and I think somebody's going to come up with this fantastic use of AI for music, and it's going to blow us all away. Like, whoa! Um, the music I do for shows like The Bachelor, I just did. I got a placement in The Equalizer, which I'm excited about, and there's another show called Doctor Odyssey, which I got a placement in. Totally fun. Those two shows specifically, that's from a publisher that uses almost almost only live musicians. Like that's stuff that I recorded on the piano. And so a lot of publishers, a lot of production companies have said like, "Hey, we really don't want to use AI music." I'm not sure if they have a way to test it. Like sometimes you can kind of hear, but in the same way that you see a video where the hand has 7 fingers, like sometimes there's sort of tells in AI, and I don't know that it's not the same as like, oh, use the dash or whatever it is. Like it's not quite exactly that, but there's some things that we'll be able to see. I do have a concern that sort of stock music, and so it's just like stock photos. That library music might get wiped out with AI, because I think it could be easy for somebody on a production company to say like, oh, like we need music for a scene where there's 15 men and women in a bar, and they're have a heightened level of excitement, and you put exactly what you want in there, and to the production, like the music is just sort of wallpaper, and it's just back there, and like, oh, it's fine. And so what you said
Hmm.
earlier is, I think it's possible to come up with something good and fine. But for most artists, like, well, that's not what we're trying to do. Like, we want something fantastic, and we want something like for kids. I want something delightful, and I want something like that's really rich, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, because that's the risk, right? Is if we keep using AI that's going to be trained and looking at what's existing, if you do that for 10 years, then you don't have anything original coming up anymore. And so it just becomes the same thing again and again. Because if we look at the past years, things evolve all the time because artists work on it and they come up with new things. But if we keep reusing what's been done before, which, yeah, can of course for AI being like a support for the artist and the creator rather than creating the entire piece itself. Yeah, have you used like AI in your work already? Like that's something you're using?
I haven't, and as I said, AI curious, and I keep looking at the apps that are there, and part of it is it takes so long to try to put all the search terms in, and all the metadata in that I want to get what I want. Like by the time I do that, like, well, I'll just write something. I think it's very attractive if you're not sort of more of an expert at something. So I use Canva. I'm not a visual designer, and I use AI backgrounds. Like I'm not a visual designer. So if somebody's not, doesn't have a music background, I think that's where AI is like fantastic. Of like, oh, and there's this downside of like, oh, I don't have to talk to a person. Like I'm not worried about people losing jobs. Like they wouldn't have paid a musician anyway. Um, but like if you don't have to interact with somebody to learn how to do music, like, well, that's kind of a drag. But I think AI is great for those kinds of projects. It's like a DIY project. I think it's great for that.
Yeah, and I also, yeah, what you were saying about how it can be an entry point for someone who doesn't know music. So because I was talking about like people who don't have a formal training in music maybe not being able to create those pieces, but it can be an entry point and then create that motivation and that excitement and eventually learning on the ground. So I feel it's like a most more opportunity for experiential learning that you were mentioning before rather than formal training in music to get to a certain point. Because I know some for example some uh, beat makers in rap, for example, that started straight with digital like music and eventually got to learn some piano to be able to create their melody. But they really started with that. That's how they create all the instruments, and they don't have that formal music training, but they create like amazing music. So that's
And I,
interesting.
I am I am biased because I have formal music training, but you don't
Mm.
necessarily need it. Like you can do amazing things. That's an interesting example. I always thought that the game Rock Band that had the guitar where you're playing, on, there's a game basically, and you're trying to play the numbers. You have a guitar in your hand. I thought it'd be cool if they had an upgrade where you flip it around and it's actually a guitar where it had strings and frets. Because there's people that already had this like thing in their house, and I wonder how many people actually went on to learn guitar, because I absolutely believe in sort of the gateway of like let's like have people play more instruments. I personally think the um hardest thing about learning an instrument is just having one, and just having the proximity of the instrument. Maybe having a model of somebody playing it, you could probably get pretty close with a video of like, hey, this is how it's supposed to be played. But lessons are fun, but they're not super necessary at the beginning unless you're hurting yourself. And then when you show promise, like maybe that's a time. But yeah.
Mm. Yeah, there's definitely a question of exposure and access for sure. Like it's expensive. Like most instruments are expensive. I learned drums when I was young. I mean, drums is like the worst instrument when you're a parent. You're like, I don't want drums in my house. So
The one good
so
thing
yeah,
about
and
the
it's
drummer is that a lot of times that means if you're in the band, like your friends are hanging out at your house. So then you know where your kid is. Like that's the one good thing about drums.
that's true. That's true. Um, but yeah, there's definitely a question of access because that's expensive, that takes space and exposure too. Because there's like if you're in a family that doesn't play an instrument, it's hard to get like the motivation or like the interest in playing instruments. But one thing that I learned, actually, I would love to have your take on that, is that for me, learning drums was not very exciting because I didn't like to like practice. That was the thing, but I just enjoyed playing. And really, I started enjoying music when I started playing with others. Like when I started like middle school and having a band, and I had a bunch of bands after that. And I still did not practice much on my own, but playing with them was extremely fun and exciting. And so I wonder if um, the fact that will be that people are creating more and more on computers, doing all the instruments on their own, if that's going to take out some of that collaborative element.
I would hope not. I mean, I think I definitely know what you're saying, but I think well, there's just a magic, a synchronicity of playing with other people. And I would hope that schools are a place where kids can have that experimentation, whether it's, being in a choir when you're young, or having access at least to be able to try an instrument. And so even when you're when you're starting out, like you kind of sound bad. Like it's hard because like, especially in middle school, like, oh, I don't want to do something where I'm sounding bad. And like it's just hard. I get that. But there is something about when you're playing something you like once you're in your band and you're choosing the material with your friends, like, wow, this is awesome. So I think it's tough. Like so many people, will come up to me and say like, "Oh, I played when I was young. I wish my parents kept me in lessons." Like, well, no, you probably hated it. Like, and you probably had a perfectly fine teacher. It's not your teacher's fault. I mean, I was the kid that you'd have to tell to stop playing to come to dinner, and so like I had a good teacher, um, but my teacher was just sort of part of what I did. Like I I kind of practiced what I was supposed to until age 12 when I had a jazz teacher, but I also played by ear. Like it's just I don't know. I think there's some kids that are absolutely drawn to it. Um, but I do think like there's this other sort of middle group that like are kind of interested and it's kind of social. And to me, I'm really selfish in that that's our future audience for classical music, for dance, for opera, for jazz music. And we need to cultivate that. So I don't worry as much about people playing music together because I think there's always going to be like a singer songwriter who has a voice who she needs to get her songs across, and then she's going to need to find a band. And the joke is the bass player went for the first couple lessons and learned the first string, and then the second lesson they learned stuff on the second string, the third, and then he called the fourth lesson and like, hey, I can't make it, I got a gig. And so that it's absolutely one of those instruments that you don't really you need to be good enough at. But I worry more about having audiences and being able to have people that are appreciating music. I think that's a larger issue.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, that leads us to like the last question. If you could design a school around one thing, what would it be and why?
So I think it's back to something I said earlier around communication. And I think you can teach, math and literature and everything through it. But I think a lot of that could happen on the playground through play. I noticed, so I do a project where I write music with first, second, and third graders at public schools nearby. And I noticed when I was coming in after COVID, a lot of these kids some of them didn't have preschool, and they didn't know how to just sort of be in school. Like they didn't know how to raise their hand, they didn't know how to sit. And so that's of course annoying to the teachers, but it's hard for the other kids because some of the other kids were just like there to learn, like they're ready for it. And so I think ongoing, like that's just gonna be something that's super important. So, I think there's a great push of learning social and emotional learning ideas in schools when you're young, but I think it has to be the whole time. And I think it has to be all through high school. Here's my bonus idea. I think middle school should be taught on a farm. I think middle schoolers are going through so
Mm.
much stuff, like all of the reproductive stuff. They stink, like they're, hair's growing in weird places. And if they're in a muddy, gross area, like with cows and pigs, and they see how vegetables grow, I think that's just a much better environment for them. It's not an experience I had. It's just after having two middle schoolers, and I don't want them to be away necessarily. Like, hopefully, there's a farm that's like not too far away from a city, and I don't know who's going to pay for this either. But I just love the idea of like get them out to a farm.
I like this idea. That was an awesome conversation, Jerome. Thank you so much. Where can people find more information about you and your work?
Yeah, so you can always find me on LinkedIn. It's Jerome Rossen. Two S's, Rossen, and then my website is good. It needs to be updated, but it's freshmademusic.com.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll put the links in the description. Yeah, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. What a fun conversation.